Okay, so first, let me introduce myself. So, my name is Emily. I work for a company called NX. I like hiking, running, and skiing. And I ran a half marathon last Sunday. So, yeah. Thank you. So here's a picture of me running. So this is the agenda for the presentation today. So first, I'm going to show you how to create a React Native workspace. Then I'm going to add TanStack and a React Query to my workspace, how to do unit testing, how to do debugging. Then I'm going to add Redux to my workspace. And how do I add a slice, how do I do unit testing and debugging. So let's get started. So this is the example app I'm going to demo for this presentation. So it is a simple two-page application that shows a random interesting fact about cats. It is a two-page app, and the statement for this one is pretty simple, but you can definitely scale it up. So the app is actually in iOS and Android store already, so if you want to check it out, it's free to download. So let's get started. So before we start, something to clarify. So the example in the presentation is using NX. So what is NX? NX is my company, and it is also the open source tool created by my company. So what does NX do? It is a monorepo tool. In the example, you will see there are multiple applications and libraries under one workspace. So NX helps you to manage the multiple React Native application in the monorepo. However, if you're using React Native CLI or Expo CLI, the same concept should still apply. So whenever NX creates a library, if you use React Native or Expo CLI, you can just simply create a folder or file wherever you want. So I did get a question of what is monorepo here in this meetup before I start. So I pulled this diagram from the monorepo.tools website. So on the top, you see is monorepo. So under your organization, different application and libraries are under one workspace. Whereas on the bottom is polyrepo, so each app and application are under its own repo, and if they have some common share logic, it's usually do npm link, or basically you build a library and re-import it through npm install. So this is monorepo with polyrepo. So another thing I want to clarify is the state management is same for React web application. So if you use TanStack, React Query or Redux for native app, the same concept should apply for web application. The only difference I mentioned is debugging and the unit testing flow. So debugging and the unit testing for native app is a bit different from the web app. So let's get started. So let's create a workspace. So there are a couple ways you can create your React Native workspace. You can usually use the React Native CLI or Expo CLI, but since I work for NX, so I'm going to show you the NX way. So here, in terminal, enter npx create NX workspace. Then I'm going to name my workspace React Native Workspace. The tech stack I'm going to choose is React. And the framework, you can either choose Expo or React Native. So for this case, I'm going to choose Expo. And the application name, I'm going to name it Cats. And for this demo, I'm just going to disable distributed caching for now. So, here. So this is the workspace you get. So notice under your workspace apps, it has the React Native app you create. So I put two diagrams here. So left is for Expo workspace, and right is React Native workspace. I think there are a lot of React web developers here. So I'm just quickly going through what is Expo and what is the difference between Expo and the React Native, and when to choose Expo and when to choose React Native. So in short, Expo is a schedule tool built on top of React Native. So React Native is open source and it's free to use. However, Expo has some paid build service. So for a managed Expo project, notice it only has a source folder. It doesn't have the Android and iOS folder here. So for a managed Expo project, developers do not need to maintain the iOS and Android native code. Also, Expo has this paid build service. So even if you don't have a MacBook and you want to build for iOS app, so Expo allows you to build on the cloud to build for the iOS app. However, there's a free tier. but after a certain number of bills, you have to pay. So that is the difference between Expo and the React Natives. So after you create your workspace, so then let's add a state management here. So another thing I want to clarify is what's the difference between server state and the client state. So in short, when you're calling an API and dealing with the synchronous data, that is a server state. Everything else about UI, dealing with synchronous data, that's a client state. So TanStack is a server state library, and the Redux is a client state library. So here is a long list of libraries you need to install before you can do anything with state management. So you need to install the TanStack Query and the DevTool. Also, you need to install the Redux library. So I'm going to use Redux Toolkit, its DevTool, Logger, and the storage as well. So another thing I want to quickly mention is for React Native, it's not a web browser, so it doesn't have anything like local storage or session storage. So for storage, you need to implicitly install this library called React Native Async Storage to handle the storage here. So after we install this library, so first, let's add a query here. So what is a query? I pull this definition from the TanStack website. So query is declarative dependency on a synchronous source of data that is tied to a unique key. A query can be used with any promise-based method, including get and post method, to fetch data from a server. So that's a definition. It's pretty long, and it sounds pretty confusing to me at first. But in short, just remember it's anything to do dealing with calling a backend API. So let's see an example of what a query does here. So here, this is how Redux would handle calling an API here. So this is a typical Redux state that stores API information. For the API, you need to store what's the loading status here. So it has multiple loading status, not loaded, loading, loaded, arrow. You also need to throw the arrow from the response, also the response itself. And when you're calling the API, this example using Redux thunk to calling the API and handle asynchronous data. So yeah, it currently is a placeholder. This is the state and the Redux thunk, and also you also need a reducer to handle calling the API here. So this is what reducer will look like. To handle the Redux thunk, it needs at least 3 action cases. So if the thunk is pending, I need to set the loading status to loading. If the thunk is fulfilled, I need to set the loading status to be loaded. If the thunk is rejected, I need to set the loading status to be error. So that's a lot of code to handle API here. So what does React Query do? So React Query standardizes and simplifies the process. So on the top, it is a Redux state. And on the bottom, it is the code for React Query. So for Redux state, you need to store the loading status. However, for the React Query, it provides you with many variables to get the loading status. For example, is fetching, is error, is success. That's all corresponding to the loading status in the Redux state. You also returns the error and the data, which correspond error and the data, error and response for the Redux state as well. So as you can see here, we don't need any reducer or Redux thunk to handle the API information. So we only need this use query function provided from React Query here. So let's see a real example, and let's create our first query here. So for this one, every time I click the cross button on the page, I need to call the API backend and fetch a new information. So I need a query to do that. So this is the next way of how you create a library here. So in the terminal, you type in npx nx generate, then the framework, then the library name, then followed by directory. Obviously, the command line is pretty long. You can use this tool called NX Console. So this is a plugin for VS Code and IntelliJ. So this is the interface for NX for VS Code. So if, for example, I want to generate, then you provide you a list of different types of application libraries you want to generate. You only need to fill in the name and directory you want. So for this case, I want to generate an Expo library called use cat fact. Directory is under queries. So under the workspace library folder, under queries folder, you will see there's a useCat library generated for me. And under this library, there's a placeholder file under its unit test. So this is how to generate a library using NX here. So then, this is how our query looks like. So we import use query from the React Query library. The query key is cat fact. The query function, inside the query function, we're going to fetch this API, and then basically just going to return the response as it is here. So this is our first query. And how do I use this query inside my components here? So for example, whenever user click a button here, I need to call the API and refresh the information here. So I get the refresh function from the query, then I get the different query results from the refresh function. So based on the query result, I can perform different actions here. So the query result returns me the fetch status, is error, is loading, is success, and also the response as well. So based on this one, I can perform different action here. So here are the use query properties that could replace the loading status in the Redux state. In the example, Redux state has loading status, and we need to track whether the response is not loaded, loaded, or error. So use query property has variable for each of the cases. For example, is loading means the query has no data. Is error means the query encounter an error. Is success means query was success and data is available. So another thing is we can integrate the loading status with our dummy components here. For example, we can write the component UI depends on the results of the API here. So is error, is loading success. I can use this as a prop and pass into my dummy components here. And I can call UI depends on this prop. So now we create a query and integrate with a component. So how do I do unit testing though? So here, if you call the query function directly, you'll get this error. So if I just call a query use cat flag and trying to expect equals to something, I will get this error called invalid hook call. So how do I unit test my query here? So first thing, we don't want to call a backend API every time we actually do unit testing. So we need to mock the response here. So it depends which library you use. If you use fetch, my approach would be just install this library called just fetch mock. And in my just test setup, I also need to call fetch mock to enable mocks. If I'm using else, I need to install this one library called else mock adapter. So this library will allow me to actually mock my API responses here. And another thing I need to do is mock the query provider as well. So for use query, you can only be called inside of a query client provider here. So I create this test wrapper component, and then you wrap its children inside the query client provider here. So after I mock the response and the client provider here, so now I can render my query using this here. So if you're a React web developer here, you probably use the render hook from testing library React. But for React Native, just change the library into testing library React Native. And then you can wrap the use cat fact, that's a query inside the render hook, and put inside wrapper of the mock query client wrapper we just create. So this is how you actually render the hook of the query here. So here is an example of unit testing that tests a query client. So first, I'm going to mock a response. Then I'm going to render the query inside render hook with the mock wrapper. Then I'm going to refresh the query and wait for the loading status to be done. Then I check whether the result is successful or not. Then I check whether the returned response data matches what I got from the mock response here. And similarly for the 500 error, so this is for a failed HTTP request. So if I got 500 error here, I also render the query. And with a test wrapper, I will call a refresh to refreshing the query, then I check whether when the loading status is done, and I check whether this error is true or not. And how do I actually testing the component that consumes query here? So I use a fetch mock for this case. So you also mock the response here, and render the component with also a test wrapper. You check whether the loading spinner is showing or not, and then you check what the content is showing. So another thing I want to mention is render and wait for. The library is no longer testing library React. It's changed to testing a library for React Native. So this is how you're testing components that's consuming the use query here. So summary is how do you test? So install the mock response library here, create a mock query client wrapper, and then in the test you mock the response, and you render the hook with mock create client wrapper. So this is how you do unit testing. How about debugging? So debugging for React Native is a bit tricky. You cannot just right-click and inspect element like you do as web application. So, and also the React Query dev kit is only supporting web. So the easiest way to do that is interpolate your native app into web application, then add Query dev kit. So it's a bit tricky to do, but there's a library that helps you do that, which is called React Native Web, which allows you to actually transform your native app into web application here. So inside your code, under the Query client provider, you add this line. So when the platform OS equals web, then you add the React Query dev tool. So this is what it will look like when you examine your app in the web browser, and then you can analyze your query using the Query dev tool. So now we go through the unit testing and debugging the server state. So how about client state? So we still leave it to Redux to do the work. So Redux is the classic state management, and setting up Redux for React Native is pretty much the same for React web application. So for the demo, I'm going to also show the next way of creating a Redux slice here. So this is how you create a library in using NX. So same command, npx NX generate, the type of library, followed by library name and the directory. So Redux, NX has this generator called Redux. So you can, in your browser, type in npx NX generate, NX React Redux, and this will generate a slice for you. So you don't need to create one from scratch here. So for example, in my workspace, I type in npx NX generate, NX React Redux likes. Inside the project, statecat, and the directory is likes. So under my library folder, under statecat, there's a likes folder, and it creates the two slides for me. So the slides and its unit testing. So this is the next way of doing things. So this is something I want to keep track of using my Redux state here. So for my application, I have this like box, which is similar to like a like button. So user can choose to like the current content on the page here. So I want to keep track of this information in the storage. So as part of user history here. So this is my likes entity will look like. So it has ID and the content, which is corresponding to the text on the page and the date added. So after I have this like entity here, so this was my slice will look like. So I use create entity adapter from Redux toolkit. So for those who don't know, create entity adapter is a helper function that generates pre-built reducer and selectors. So with this adapter, my reducer will be pretty simple. So if user chooses to like something, I can just call likes adapter at 1. If user chooses to remove something, I can just call likes adapter remove 1. If they choose clear, I can call likes adapter remove all. So this is what the slice or reducer will look like. After I create this reducer, I need to create my root reducer. So I copied that, I got that likes reducer and put into combine reducer, and then I got my rule reducer. I got my rule reducer, now I need my rule store. So this is a function to create rule store. Since I want to persist my store, I need to pass in the rule reducer into persistor reducer from Redux persist. After I create my store using config store, I also need to pass my store into persist store from Redux persist as well. So this is how I'm going to persist the store information on the storage here. So how do I integrate my store with my component here? So as I mentioned before, there's no such thing as local storage or session storage for React Native. So I need to import from React Native sync storage. I pass in the sync storage to persist config and create my root store using the persist config here. Then I got the store and persister from my root config, and I pass in the persister to persist gate and the store to store provider. So this is how I integrate the store with my app component. So how do I do unit testing with Redux here? So if I just renders my component directly, I'll get this error. So could not find store in context of connect bookmark or whatever component you're testing. So the easiest way, or my approach, would be just mock up the store here. So I need to install this library called Redux mock store. And before the each unit testing, I just mock the store with my initial root state. And inside my unit testing, when I render it, I wrap my component inside the provider and pass the mock store into this provider here. So this will help you to unit testing your component. How about debugging here? So as I mentioned before, you cannot just right-click and see the console log and or using the dev tool. So gladly, Expo has this feature called OpenJS Debugger. So if you open the Expo menu and you launch the JS debugger, so it's similar to the Chrome debugger. You can see all your Redux log here. However, if you want to use the Redux DevTool extension here, the easiest way is just to interpolate your native app into a web app. Then you can use the Redux DevTool extension to debug your state information here. So the summary is the state management is using TanStack or React Query and the Redux. For the debugging, the easiest way is to interpolate the native app into web app, and then you can use the different tools. And for unit testing, the approach is just to mock the response and store, and then you can do the unit testing. And another thing, since I work for NX, now I'm going to promote my company's open source tool. So most native mobile apps usually use a web app associated with it. So if you need to maintain both native and web application, NX is a powerful tool. All the state management libraries I create during this demo can be reused for web application. So if you got an NX monorepo, so with NX it's easy to share libraries and business logic between different applications here. So this is my end of my presentation. I know I cover a lot of information, but I do have a GitHub repo that's containing my demo, so you can visit that GitHub repo. And this is my Twitter and my email. So thank you. Any questions? Oh, there's a question.
Oh, question. There you go.
I have a question as to why you opted out to use TanStack or React Query when you can use ReactTO Query, which is built on top of Redux toolkit for the data fetching side of it.
Okay, so the question is, why do I use TanStack Query when you can use
ReactTO Query, which is
yeah, I never tried that one, so that's why I have Any question? Any other question?
yeah, I got one. So the index generator that you were showing,
Yeah.
is it kind of, do you guys have like a generalized scaffolding engine where you write like a template and you put it up in this like registry, and then it like, because you were doing NX generate, and then you were using @NX / React Redux. Is that something that is like a public repository where these things go up, right? It's like a community thing.
Okay, so the question is whether when I write an NX generator, whether it's a repository or it's something someone
right.
can.
Where does this come from?
Okay, so mostly it's written by the open source community, where it's under the NX open source, where there's preset of generators you can choose from or pick from. However, if you want to create your own, NX does have a feature called like NX plugin that allows you to write your own plugin and own template to generate like whatever you want. It depends on the template you're passing.
And can you make some for? I noticed that you did like NX generate, but you didn't specify which package, right, of the monorepo. But you have that like you can say that, right? Like you pick the Angular package and then create a component there or something like that, right?
Yeah, so you can choose like an NX generator, a type of plugins like Angular, React, anything, like generate application or libraries inside.
That's what I mean. Is it only generate application, or can you like change, update an existing application?
Oh, only generate a new application.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Because, yeah. Fair enough.
So with the library,
Huh?
like you guys build the library or the only generative?
Sorry, I didn't hear.
Like NX is it a library?
NX is like you can think as a CLI or a whole set of tools. So it's not a single like library like React.
So
It's more like.
can we use like Saga? Like have you heard of Saga?
No.
Yes.
Oh, Redux Saga. Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely you can using Redux Saga. You can choose whatever state management you want. So NX is just like manages your file in folder structure. It doesn't limit your library choice. Anything else? Anyone else? No? Okay.
Awesome.